Hey, how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net, and in this video we're going to be working on Cyber-Spectre, the illustration that I began sketching up last week. Now, again, for those who have just come in, basically this illustration was in fact a commission that I was employed to do for a creator called Richard Ems, and it was for his book Cyber-Spectre. And he essentially gave me a bit of a brief. He wanted these two lovely lady characters drawn up in a particular composition for one of the front covers that he was going to use for the book. And he kickstarted the project. Huge admiration for any independent creator who manages to be able to pull that off somehow. And yeah, I mean, it was a real honor to be able to work on this particular project. I had a great time drawing up these characters. Now, the designs for the characters were already established. He sent me a few screenshots from the previous comics that they'd been featured in, so I knew what they looked like, which gave me a lot of material to work with in order to get started on this particular illustration. So all I really had to come up with is a captivating composition that I could use for the illustration that I was going to feature them in. And there were a few guidelines that Richard Ems gave me in addition to the characters that had already been created. And that was just that he wanted both of these particular characters in the one composition. He wanted one sitting and one standing, I believe, or, some variation of that, and a city in the background. So in this video, what we're going to do is take the rough sketch that I did up in last week's video of Cyber-Spectre, and we're going to ink right over the top of it. Now, I'm only going to be inking the primary outline within this particular demonstration. Next week, when we bring out the third and final installment of this particular illustration series, we'll get into the rendering and the finer details that'll complete the inks for this illustration. And I actually wasn't employed to color this one. That was someone else's job after I'd inked it. So, yeah, that was a little bit of a letdown, I guess, but that wasn't Richard M's fault by any means. I just didn't have the time to do it. And I often don't have the time to take on commissions, which is why I only take on fun ones like this, where I'm able to draw some cool-looking characters who I find interesting, who I find inspiring myself, and I often like to take on work that I think will be a good fit for me and my personal abilities that I've developed, because I think if you can find a job that complements your skill set, then everyone's going to be happy. The client's going to be happy. You're going to be happy. You'll have an absolute ball working on the project. And it's really a perfect marriage, I would say. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening on the screen here. I'm in Manga Studio, as always. I love this application. It's my preferred application of choice. It's ultra affordable. So, I got this question in a previous video, only this week, in fact, as to how expensive Manga Studio was, whether or not it was a free application. It's not free, but it is, again, very, very affordable. In fact, I checked the website just before. It is now known as Clip Studio Paint, but it's still the same application. They just changed the name for one reason or another, and it still works like a charm. And the amount to which it's being sold for at the moment is, the cheapest package, I think, or the most affordable package, is about like $50. Like, it's nothing in comparison to more prestige graphics applications like Photoshop and whatnot. And I think for the more advanced package of Clip Studio Paint, it is, about $125 or so. But again, still really, really cheap. So if you're on a budget and you're looking for a killer application that's going to allow you to do slick, sharp, energetic line art for your comic book illustrations, I highly suggest checking out Manga Studio, aka Clip Studio Paint. You won't regret it. I certainly haven't. It's fantastic for line art. I don't really use it that much for coloring. I use Photoshop for that, and just because I've come up with a really solid workflow for coloring comic book illustrations in Photoshop. So because I have become accustomed to that particular way of coloring and working, that particular workflow, I guess I haven't really ventured into any other applications and explored the potential opportunities that they may offer. But that's just because I hate change. I'm a little bit lazy, and I like to stay within my comfort zone with that stuff. I'm not lazy, actually. I'm a bit of a workaholic, but I'm lazy when it comes to change. I don't like change too much. So as I said before, the main goal with this particular demonstration will be to go over the rough draft that I laid down to establish the composition overall of the illustration in the last lesson, is to go over the top of that and give it a nice, slick, sharp-looking inked outline. And that's all that I'm going to be focused on. Now, what does that entail? So in Manga Studio, I'm using the G Pen tool. The G Pen tool, I don't really mess with. I use the default settings that the application comes packaged with. I don't mess with them because it already works pretty darn fine. That is the beauty of Manga Studio. That's the beauty of Clip Studio Paint, is that their tool set really does feel quite traditional in the sense that it actually feels like you're using a pen on the page. Like it feels uncannily similar, in fact. And so I don't really mess with the settings that much, and I just I start inking down onto the page with those tools. And the way in which that I get the line for the G Pen that you're seeing me lay down here on the canvas is that I simply adjust the size of my brush depending on the area that I'm working on. So, if you want a thicker line, naturally you're going to increase the size of your brush. If you want a thinner line that is more subtle, that is finer, then you'll want to shrink it down. Okay, so that's really all I'm kind of messing around with. Other than that, other than the size of the brush itself, what I do try to kind of balance the line out with is just the amount of pressure that I'm applying to my stylus at any one point in time as I'm inking this illustration out. And it's the combination of the amount of pressure that I'm applying and the size of the brush that's allowing me to capture the lines that you're seeing here on the page. It's really that simple. There's nothing more to it than that. There's no secret brush that I'm using. There is no, trick to what I'm doing. It's the basic settings within Manga Studio, and then just a really steady hand that's carefully balanced in conjunction with the size of the brush and the amount of pressure that I'm applying. But yeah, and then all I've got to do at that point is go over the top of the rough sketch, the draft that I've laid down to essentially capture the foundations for the composition of the illustration. All I've got to do then is find the lines within that rough draft that I want to refine and articulate with the finished inked outline. Okay, and that, of course, can be a little bit difficult to capture sometimes because depending on how rough the draft is, it's one of those situations where you kind of have to you have to guess what line to go with, and sometimes you even have to make it up completely. Again, it depends on how refined your pencils are. Now, you'll notice that mine aren't that refined. I don't take my pencils to a super polished level of refinement before I jump into the inks, just because I find it much more optimal and time-saving to jump into the inks after the basic draft is down, since the inks are going to be really what represents the final line art. It's not going to be the pencils. No one will ever see the pencils in the printed product. All they're going to see is the final inks. So, of course, when I was developing my comic art workflow, I was kind of like, why am I taking all this time to polish up the pencils of my comic book art when ultimately they're never going to be seen? Again, it's not the pencils that are seen. It is the final polished line art that is presented through the inks. So I decided just to skip the polished pencils altogether and lay in the final line art as I was inking the illustration. Now, that took a little bit of time to get confident with because I had become very accustomed to polishing up my pencils before I jumped onto the inking stage. And that was comfortable because it meant that the exact line that I was going to be inking over was already there on the page. I didn't really have to guess where the inks needed to go. I didn't have to guess what the line was going to look like in its final form. All I had to do was trace straight over the top. And that was okay. Like, that worked pretty well, and I got good at making it work well. But the strange thing is that no matter how clean my inks were, no matter how well weighted the final line work ultimately ended up as, there was just something missing from it that was present in the pencils. It was some level of genuine first-time creativity. You know, the kind of genuineness that you see when you lay down a line for the first time. And because I'd already done that in the penciling stages and then kind of traced over the top with the inks, I really didn't find that I was capturing the lines in their best light, in the best way that they possibly could. In fact, the pencils often look better than the inks, and I thought, why? Why is that? Because the inks are supposed to be really what complements the pencils, as in, once the illustration is inked, it is the inks that should be looking the best, that should look better than the pencils. It should be the other way around, right? But that wasn't the case for me. And so, I guess after a while, I kind of looked at my workflow and the way in which I was approaching comic book illustration as a whole, and I decided that, hey, I need to make some changes here, because not only was my line work not looking its best when I'd ultimately inked it, it also took me a very long time to arrive at a finished piece in that particular workflow, because I'd be spending, back then it was taking about, 8 to 10 hours or so to pencil an illustration, and then another 8 to 10 hours to actually ink it up. And this was a fairly complex illustration. It doesn't take me anywhere near that long now, by the way. I've sped up considerably. I can get a decent illustration done in a day now. And by a day, I mean maybe 4 hours or so. But, if you add together the fact that it took me, let's say 8 hours to pencil the illustration and another 8 hours to ink it, that was 16 hours to complete a single illustration. Sometimes it was even longer than that. Sometimes it was double that. And it was just ridiculous, because I didn't have a lot of work that I was turning out at that point. And so something had to change. And I figured that if I just cut the middleman out and didn't spend so much time articulating the pencils and leaving them rough, leaving them a little bit loose, then I'd be able to essentially cut my production time in half. I'd be able to get things done in half the time. And so that'd be a good thing, because as a comic book artist, you want to be able to work as fast as possible while still capturing the same level of quality and sacrificing as little of it as you possibly can along the way as you speed up your production workflow. And so I did that, and the really cool thing was that I found in doing that as a result is I felt like I could be a little bit more creative with my inking at that point. Because the pencils were so loose and not as refined, it allowed me to kind of get creative with how those final inks were going to look. And with that creative freedom, I was able to capture the genuine look that I was capturing within the pencils previously. Okay, meaning that the final line art had that energy back in it. It wasn't as stiff anymore. It wasn't as synthetic and clean cut. It looked like it had been created for the very first time. It didn't look like I was tracing over the top of something else anymore. It looked like it was being created on the fly as I was inking in those lines. And it was as if I was laying them down for the first time. And I really liked that, because not only did it feel more creative for me as an artist and more exciting, because, it was almost like, instead of the inks just being kind of like a refinement stage for the pencils, they became a progression of the pencils, a progression of the illustration as a whole. And that was something that I really liked. I found it very fulfilling as a comic book artist. I think that's something that ultimately a lot of pencilers run into when they start to try to ink their own work. I always wanted to ink my own work. I never really considered having anyone else ink it or even color it, unless I could find somebody who was going to be able to complement, not just my pencils, but the ideas and the style and the energy that I wanted the final illustration to present in as a finished product. And so, after a while, I decided that, hey, you know what, I'll just learn all these skills on my own. I'll figure out how to ink. I'll figure out how to color. And that way, my entire vision will be able to be realized by me in the way that I imagined it. And so I guess to an extent that was a kind of non-productive approach, because obviously if you can pass your pencils onto an inker to complete the illustration with the final line art, that means that you can jump straight onto the next pencils. That means you can jump onto the next illustration while they're inking it. But, I was doing all three components of comic book illustration on my own. So I was penciling, I was inking, and I was coloring. So any shortcuts that I could pull off in a way that wasn't going to sacrifice the appeal and the quality of my comic book art to too big of an extent, I was willing to explore. And explore it, I did. And I'm really happy with the workflow that I've come up with now. I think it is optimized, and I continue to optimize it every single day. I try to figure out new ways in which I can work, new ways in which I can produce even these videos here on YouTube, actually. You might have noticed that there has been a lot more of them come out as of recently, after a long hiatus away from putting them out. And one of the big changes that happened was simply that I found a new way of approaching it, of thinking about it, and optimizing the production workflow. So it applies to all aspects in your life, no matter what it is you're producing, whether it's producing your art or, and it could be comic book art, it could be art in any other form, it could be music, it could be movies, whatever it is. Make sure that you're trying to optimize and continuously improve upon not just the look of your art and the aesthetic and the quality of it, but also the workflow itself, how it's produced, so that you can get things done more quickly. And that's not just for money purposes, but that's also for the fact that, hey, you've only got a limited amount of time that you're going to be able to do this stuff. Not that you're not going to be able to do it well into your old age, but you're going to start to get a little bit stiff in the hands. I'm only, I'm pretty close to 30, and I'm already starting to get more stiff in the hands. I'm getting a little bit more tired. I'm not physically able to produce more stuff anymore, whereas when I was younger, I could. And so you really want to use what you've got while you've got it, because it won't be there forever. We all kind of get old, and it's a sad truth. Look, it's a sad truth. But hopefully you'll always be able to draw something. But my point is that the more you can optimize your process now, the more work that you can produce. And if you can look back on your portfolio someday and you can see the volume of work that you put out and be proud of it. And, I think that every artist wants that. While they can do it, while they can create art, they want to create as much of it as they possibly can. So back to what's happening here on the screen. You can see that I've taken a break on the inks a little bit, and I've turned back on the underlying rough draft that I started out with for the foundations. You can see it in blue there. I like to change the underlying layers to blue just so that I can make a visual distinction between the more refined illustration and the really rough foundational illustration. That way I can kind of tell what's going on a little bit better, and it's clearer to see. And what I'm doing is I'm placing in a background city drop for these lovely ladies. Now, when I was talking to Richard about what he wanted to go for with this illustration and the kind of background scene that he wanted, because I gave him a few options. I said, look, I can give you the two characters and it's going to cost this much as a commission. But I can put in a background and it'll be a little bit more expensive, but it'll look more cool. And he went for the background. Obviously, if you're going to do a complex background, which is full of intricate details like this, it's going to take longer for you to do as an artist. So if you're working on commission for a client, you're going to need to charge more for this stuff, just based on time. The considerably larger amount of time that it's going to take you to complete the illustration, from the fact that you're going to need to spend a greater length of time and energy putting in the additional details into the backdrop. And you can see that this backdrop takes up a lot of real estate on the canvas. Like there's a lot of white covered there with buildings. So it's going to take not just a while to draw this up and to lay it in there, but also to ink it, which we are going to jump onto next in just a little bit. In order to come up with these buildings, you can see that I'm blocking them out first. The general shape or silhouette, if you will, just a very, very basic rough outline. And you'll notice that the outlines over to the right, where I'm going to detail those buildings in a second, you'll notice that they're not straight up and down lines. There's actually some interesting shapes going on with them. And the reason that I make it so that they got these cool and interesting shapes is just so that there's more visual interest happening within the design of the buildings themselves. Now, I haven't put a whole lot of time into, thinking about how they're going to be architected or anything like that, but I am trying to make them interesting. And I know that the general theme for this illustration is, it's set in a sci-fi world, so I want to try to get that vibe across to the audience as they're looking at the illustration. And I feel like I did a pretty good job on that. It was still fairly simple. Like, it's not an overly detailed backdrop, but it appears as though there's a lot of detail there. I guess when you're looking at a single one of these buildings, it's pretty simplified. It's kind of interesting outline, and then you've got some windows in it, and a few details here and there. Naturally, you'll notice that I've attempted to draw everything in perspective, but I haven't drawn a perspective grid. And I don't like to draw perspective grids because I feel like it confines the drawing to a very static, very how would you put it? It's just a very stagnant blueprint, right? It's a very rigid set of rules that you're trying to fit the drawing into, and I would rather fit the perspective around my idea. And so I kind of put my creativity first when it comes to drawing backdrops, or really anything in perspective. I'll lay down the initial draft first, I'll scribble it out. It may not be in perfect perspective, but then I'll go back and I'll kind of draw in a few perspective grid lines just to make sure everything is drawn with the correct perspective, and that it's going to kind of recede and come into the foreground in a way that looks accurate and realistic. But yeah, I don't like perspective grids at all. And I certainly don't use them first and foremost, just because, again, what I find is that you end up with a very boring looking artwork. That's all. I just feel like it doesn't have any soul to it. It feels very manufactured, and it's, again, it loses its energy. I think the more refined you get with this stuff, the more it loses its energy. And the real battle for most comic book artists is just trying to maintain that energy throughout the illustration as you develop it and take it to a more refined level of articulation. And the way in which you do that is you try to keep those lines energetic. You really try to make sure that the illustration doesn't flatten out in the process as best you can, that there's movement in the lines, that there's shape to them, and that those shapes are strong and I don't want to say rigid, but they just have a certain level of aliveness to them, and that aliveness often comes through via the line weights that you add in. And by line weights, I haven't really added them in yet. Usually I'll leave the line weights for the final stages, where I am placing in the rendering and the additional details that I use to really polish up the drawing. But Yeah, the line weights are really just, again, variation in the thickness of your line in the right areas, according to the lighting conditions within the illustration, according to the elements that are in the foreground in comparison to the background. Elements that are closer to you are going to have a thicker outline than elements that are further away, and so on and so forth. Line weights can really indicate a lot of different things within our depth perception when we look at an illustration. So they're one of the most undersold little tactics that inkers kind of use to really add a whole lot of depth within their illustrations, even with a lack of additional details and rendering. There's a lot that you can say just through the lines within your artwork and the main outlines. And you can see, even if I haven't really added them in consciously, that I've kind of placed them in on the fly here, the line weights, and there's already a little bit of depth going on. And I think that it does add a lot. It really does make a difference. I noticed that when I first began adding line weights to my illustrations, thanks to the great David Finch, because that's where I learned it, I noticed that my artwork just started looking a lot more professional, and it looked much more pro. Before that, it looked kind of amateurish, and it didn't really have any depth. It didn't have any oomph. It didn't have anything going on with it. And as soon as I added those line weights, it just made such a significant improvement. In fact, you can see me adding line weights in underneath the different panels within this building right now, and that's a great example as to how I would use them. But you can see me starting to add the inks in over the top of the draft background that I did up just before, and there's a lot of straight lines that I'm dealing with. Notice, however, that I'm not using a ruler, I'm not using any aids to help me draw these lines out. Again, just as with the perspective grid guide, that tends, at least for me, to lead to an illustration that lacks life. It looks way too manufactured, and you can tell because it's almost too perfect. The fact that it's too perfect is what gives it away, that it's been automated, that it hasn't really had the artistic, the genuine artistic input of the creator themselves, and it's just been automated by a machine. And to me, that's kind of not what this is about. I think that when you can really see the authenticness of the creator within their work through the mistakes and the flaws within it, that's when you have something that captures the hearts and minds and imaginations of the audience in an authentic way. But so I just I do this stuff all by hand, and it's not just, all the other stuff that I was harping on about just before. It's also for the fact that I feel like if I can do this by hand enough times, then I'm essentially practicing my ability to be able to do it by hand. So even if it's a little rough around the edges right now, and I'm a little bit unconfident with it and uncomfortable, it's okay because this is just practice. Every illustration that I create is just practice for me. I don't expect it to be perfect, and I know that would be an unrealistic expectation to have for my work anyway, because no illustration is perfect. There's always going to be something that you're unhappy with. There's always going to be room for improvement, and you better hope that that's the case, because otherwise you're not going to get better, right? I mean, if there's no room left for improvement, then that means you've kind of you've reached a certain point within your work where you can't go beyond it. You can't evolve. And I think even if you do get to a super pro status where your art is the best that it possibly can be, hey, I mean, who says that you can't take a new direction with your style? Who says that you can't try out some new subject matter or some new themes or mediums or there's so much that you can do with creativity, and it would take you multiple lifetimes to be able to master all of it. So don't ever tell me that you've reached the pinnacle of your artistic potential, because it's almost impossible, I think, unless you're some kind of super alien artist that is just able to learn this stuff in a significantly smaller amount of time. It's going to take you, again, it's going to take you an entire lifetime to master your skill. And I think that, that's when you do get mastery. That's when you do reach that point within your career where you've been there and you've done that, and you're able to pass down that wisdom to other artists coming up in the game, and really affect their progress, and move them along in their journey, and help them skip years, possibly years of blind exploration that they would have had to go through, challenges that they would have otherwise run into. So yeah, keep on pushing yourself, no matter what it is you're working on, no matter what it is you're doing, no matter what challenges you come up against. Break through them, push through them, and when you think that you pushed through every challenge that there is out there, that is probably a sign for you to mix things up a little bit. Try something different. Try exploring, some subject matter that you've never really looked into before. There's so much out there, including architectures. And I'm not just talking about architectures in terms of, the architectures around the world. Like, for example, Japan's architecture is going to be very different to North America's architecture. But I'm also talking about architecture within different genres and mediums. So, for example, here we can see a sci-fi genre, but the architecture within these buildings that you're seeing me do up here would be very, very different if the genre was instead a fantasy genre or a dark fantasy genre. So again, there's so much that you can explore and study and practice and get good at and get better at. So that's the fun of being an artist. That's the fun of being a creator, is that you can always push yourself in a new way. There's always some new level that you can aspire to reach. And I think that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me interested in this stuff, because I think even though I can stick with things for a fair while, even I'm going to get bored at some point if there's not something there to keep me immersed in the medium, to keep me intrigued. So I'm inking over the top of these buildings, and the way in which I'm able to keep these lines so steady is I try not to lift the pen up too much. I try to draw down these lines in a single stroke, a single smooth stroke. So I kind of slide my hand along the tablet, and I hope for the best. I try to avoid any wobbliness by keeping my hands super steady, and that can be very difficult because not everybody has a super steady hand, and that can take a lot of practice in and of itself, but I do my best. And again, just as with anything else, the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. But if you let the computer do all the work for you, then you're not going to get better, right? So, this is why I always kind of discourage, using 3D applications like Google SketchUp. And, there's even some artists out there in the industry, some pro artists who, they'll take a photo and they'll trace over the top of it, or at least use it as a foundation for their comic book art. And it just lacks energy. There's no fire behind it. There's no energy or power. And that's what comics are all about, at least for me. That's what comics bring to the table that no other medium does, is that ultra high octane level of life and energy and movement and over the top action that you just don't see in the everyday world. So I like to try to preserve that as much as possible in the gestures and the movements of my own hand, because the computer just, it just creates a very authentic finish for me, and I don't like it. And you can see that I don't always lay down the perfect line the first time. That cloud took me a few attempts, and so do these lines here. You can see me hitting that undo button repeatedly as I go back over the top of these very rough building outlines that I've laid down in the foundations with the final inks. And that's just part of the process for me. I know that I'm going to make mistakes. Never for a minute do I try to have a perfect run with these illustrations, because I know that that's a very unrealistic expectation, and that I'm just going to disappoint myself if I hold myself to it. So I'm going over the top of the outline for these buildings again, and I'm giving the outside contour of them, okay, so the outline of the building as a whole, a thicker outline on the buildings in the forefront of the background scene. And the reason for that is I want them to stand out against the buildings behind them. And this is where line weights really do show their power, and where we can see a great example of how using them can manufacture this really great sense of depth within the artwork. So yeah, I mean, again, anything in front of something else is going to have typically a thicker outline, and the things in the far back are going to have a thinner one. You can see this in the buildings, especially if you look at those silhouettes that I've got in the far, far, far background. You can see how thin and fine that line work is. Whereas the buildings that are up close or in the front, the buildings that I want the viewer's eye to focus in on, they're going to have a much thicker outline. And the characters, because they're at the very front of the illustration, they're going to have an even thicker outline as well. You can see around that gun, for example, that Cyber-Spectre is holding up above her head, that there's a lot of thick, dark outlines in comparison to the buildings in the backdrop. And because of that, we have a much greater amount of contrast there. There's more information and a starker amount of value that our eyes can latch onto. And so it just appears as though it's closer simply because our eyes are drawn there first. And that's just the way that our eyes work. We typically look at the things that are right in front of us rather than the things in the far background. Because if we didn't do that, we probably, it just doesn't seem like an optimal way to take in the world, right? You want to see what's in front of you first and then kind of make your way into the backdrop. Unless, of course, there's something of significance within the backdrop that you want the viewer to focus in on. So, for example, maybe there's some kind of dropship in the background that you want the viewer to kind of key in on. Well, yeah, maybe you want to give that a bit of a thicker background and really pump up those line weights just to draw attention to it. But otherwise, you want to leave everything in the background fairly subtle. And that's another reason as to why these buildings are quite simplified, why there's not a lot of detail on them. Now, the one other thing I did want to say about the building backdrop that I've composed here is that the inspiration for the way in which I go about illustrating buildings, the main influences for me have always been Jim Lee. I always admired the way that Jim Lee drew these intricate backgrounds, or at least there was intricacy suggested within these backgrounds, but he managed to execute it in a very simplified way. And I think that that's really interesting to think about as well, because oftentimes we'll take in a full illustration like this and we'll just be overwhelmed by it. We'll be like blown away by the amount of detail and the amount of intricacy within it. And it's something that we think about ourselves creating and how impossible it would be. But if you really break it down and you really look at it closely, you'll notice that actually these individual components don't have that much detail in them at all. And I did that with Jim Lee's work. I took a second look, a third look, and a fourth look at his work and how exactly he had composed it. And, talking about buildings specifically here, I looked at the backgrounds within the cityscapes that he had created. And I noticed, hey, these buildings really don't have that much rendering on them. They're really just outlines with windows. And the shape of the buildings is something else that comes into play. But other than that, there's not a whole lot going on within the line work. And because of the intricate finish, or the intricate appearing finish within these illustrations, I guess we're inclined to believe that it must look intricate because there's something else at play. There's an additional amount of rendering or cross-hatching that has been used to create that detailed aesthetic. But no, if you really look at it and you analyze it on a deeper level, you'll see that it's actually just a combination of all the simplified building shapes and structures combined that make it look detailed. Not the buildings themselves. On their own, they're actually quite simple and easy to draw up. And if you want to get good at drawing them up, if you actually want to put some of this stuff into practice, take one of these buildings and just draw it out. Try to copy it out. Maybe a few over there on the left of the image, you could try drawing up on your own in your sketchbook, and just really take note of the fact that there's maybe 3 major shapes there with some windows in between. All the details within the building are built within a silhouette, a shape for the building, that was just roughly outlined in the initial foundation stage. Always start with a foundation don't just try to jump in and create a super refined, slick looking building with your inks if you've got nothing to work over. Always start rough. That's just the way that a lot of these things are going to evolve and ultimately come about. It doesn't start off looking all pretty like this. It starts off looking quite rough around the edges, quite ugly, some might say, and it's definitely not pretty. But the process of creativity, the way in which an illustration is structured, is rough to refined. I don't really know any other way of working. I fall into the trap still sometimes of thinking that I can just go in and start creating a beautiful looking illustration without laying down a solid foundation to begin with. And it always leads me to a place where I end up regretting it. So do yourself a favor and give yourself a break. Let yourself loosen up a little bit and keep this stuff rough in the beginning. Because if you can do that, you're going to find that not only do you have more fun putting these illustrations together, but you're also, it's not like an arduous task anymore. It's just a process of development. You're not even working over the top of what's already there. You're sculpting it out more. That's how it feels for me, a lot of this, is that it's just, you're starting out with a really, really rough ball of clay, and as you go over the top of it repeatedly and you refine the line work, you're polishing it up. You're sculpting out a more refined, clearer version of what that illustration was ultimately always meant to be. And that's what I love about art, is that you don't always know how it's going to end up, and you get to watch it come together real time. And because of that unpredictability, there's a certain amount of novelty attached to it. There's a certain level of mystery and intrigue. It's like, I wonder if I keep on going with this illustration, if I just stick with it, where is it going to end up? How far can I take it? What's its ultimate form going to look like? And that's another thing that keeps me going. I think that is really the crux of creativity and creation, and what we get out of it first and foremost, is not just the end product, but the journey that we take to get to that end product. The questions that we ask ourselves and the considerations that we make, the decisions that we ultimately arrive at in order to direct the flow and the development of the illustration. That to me is what makes the artwork to the creator who brought it about, who manifested it, the relationship with them and their work special. And I think that is something that not the viewer can ever experience. No one can experience that except the creator who actually manufactured that artwork. So never take what you're able to create for granted. Never take the work that you produce for granted, because it is special and it is significant. And I think that if you can respect it as such, you'll always be motivated to create more of it. You'll admire the work that you do, not in a narcissistic, egotistical way, but just in a way where you're proud that you put in the effort, that you stuck with it, and that you've created this thing from nothing, from purely your imagination, and that it was your drive and determination that ultimately allowed you to see it through. So yeah, I mean, that's how I like to think about this stuff, and probably the reason, again, as to why I'm still doing it. It's pretty hard not to keep on doing art when you've got that kind of mindset, I think. So now I'm working on some of the details at the top of the building, just adding in some line weights around the underside of the components that make up those buildings. I'm not sure really what you would call them. I guess they're kind of like the different parts of the buildings, just above the windows. Usually when the light casts down, you're going to get a shadow under any areas that are indented into the major forms. Or if the light is coming in from the side, so in other words, the panels of these buildings that are facing away from the light, the sides of those objects are going to have a thicker outline. In other words, the dark side of an object, the contours that are defining that dark side are going to have a thicker outline. And that's, again, another use for line weights that you can add to your inking that is really going to give your illustration more depth, and it's going to suggest some sort of lighting condition within the illustration. Lighting is really what gives anything that additional level of believability. It gives it the suggestion of form. So now I'm adding some more details to that far, far background building. I just thought that it could do with it, but you'll notice how fine and how subtle those lines are, right? There is barely any thickness to them at all in comparison to the foreground buildings. Again, presenting another fantastic example of how the thickness of your lines really do create that illusion of depth within your illustration when used correctly. A lot of this stuff, it's all strategy, right? The way you use line weights, the way you render, different tones, values, the positioning and the composition of certain elements within the illustration and how you draw attention to them. These are all strategic decisions that you make as a creator through experience. You get better at it through experience that ultimately lead to a captivating illustration that draws in the viewer and immerses them in this world that they just feel like they can step into because it's been manufactured in that way by you. So now I'm going in and I'm outlining the panels of chrome tech that will be present within Cyber-Spectre's design. This ultimately looks really, really cool at the end after I go over the top of it and I render it out, but that'll be in the next video. So make sure that you tune back into the YouTube channel next week because I will be uploading the third and final installment for this series where we'll place into details and we'll start to take it through to a finish. Again, you know, I'm trying to put out a few videos at the moment that cover a variety of different topics and focus on different components that go into comic book illustration. Okay, so we've got some general tips and tricks where, I kind of get in front of the camera and I start sharing some of my philosophies with you and that kind of stuff. They're pretty cool. I enjoy making those videos for you and people seem to get a little bit out of them. And then there's my sketchbook where I'm doing up a bunch of character concepts at the moment for various clients and myself. So that's a really great way to kind of show you what projects I'm currently working on. And then there's kind of like these more intricate, more finished and complete comic book illustrations that you're going to see me draft up and ink and color from start to finish. And that's really what Cyber-Spectre is. And each week, I'll have any one of these videos put out so that you can kind of come back to them and check them out. And it's kind of like it's the kind of thing where, depending on the topic that you're most interested in, you'll be able to kind of tune in and get the knowledge that you're looking for. If you want to watch all the videos, again, we've been putting out one almost every day. Which is absolutely awesome. Like, I've never been able to do that before. But, it goes back to optimizing your process. As I was saying before, the more you can optimize your process, the more output that you're going to be able to achieve and the more value you're going to be able to contribute to your community. When it comes to your artwork specifically, you're really creating artwork to share with other people. That's what's so brilliant about it. That's almost... It's a selfless act in a way. People who say that it's wrong to show your artwork off online and just to get attention and whatnot, well, of course you should do that. Of course you should put your work out there to get validation because why else are you creating it? You're creating it for the rest of the world, not yourself. You're not we're never selfish with our artwork. Like we're creating it to give to other people, to show to other people. And of course we want them to like it. And when they give us that validation and the props and they dig it, that tells us that, hey, what we've created is working, that people are thankful for the art that we're sharing with them. So, it's definitely something that is worth noting and something that isn't wrong whatsoever. And, I highly encourage you to put your artwork out there and to show other people. Share it with the world. It's okay if it's not perfect because even if you don't get the feedback that you were hoping for, even if people don't tell you how amazing it is, hey, that's fine. You know what? Ultimately, at the end of the day, you might get some great feedback. But that is the end of this somewhat extended video demonstration. I hope you really enjoyed it and that you got some useful tips, tricks, and value out of the demonstration that you've just seen. It was a lot of fun putting it together for you. If you'd like more comic art tips, tricks, and tutorials, be sure to visit www.howtodrawcomics.net. As I was saying just before, I'm putting out a ton of new video tutorials on the site, lots of new written tutorials, including a massive how to make comics for beginners guide, which we put out a few months ago. It's huge, worth checking out, and totally free. And then we've got the courses, and the courses are great as well because a lot of these topics they kind of drill down into and give you the whole scoop on a very deep and informative level, which, you know, I think personally I wish I had that stuff back when I was learning how to do comic book art, because it would have sped up my learning curve tenfold. And you know, luckily I did have some artists out there like David Finch and Stephen Platt whose courses I did check out, and it really did make a significant improvement in my artwork, or helped me to make a significant improvement in my artwork. But other than that, thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you here in the next video. Until then, keep on practicing and keep on creating.